Kara Shalom, everyone. Welcome to our watercolor journey. This is a real-time step-by-step workshop on how to paint trees and how to use a store card to create rocks and grass. Heinrich uses Canson Heritage rough paper, and the brushes are a silver black velvet, number 12 round, a Raphael Martora, number 4 round, and a Chinese calligraphy brush. On the palette, we have Prussian blue, horizon blue, Quinacridone magenta, Quinacridone gold, and yellow ochre. Color alternatives are in brackets. The paper is taped to the board with ordinary masking tape, and the board is flat on the table. Heinrich uses a spray bottle to slightly wet the sky area, and then he starts with Prussian blue and the silver black velvet number 12 round brush. The darker blue will be at the top of the sky, and he will gradually work his way down to the horizon line where the colors will be more muted. He dips the brush in clean water to soften any hard lines and to help spread the paint. For variation, he plays around between the Prussian blue and the horizon blue. He adds a touch of Quin Magenta, which creates a soft purple in the sky. It also helps to prevent the yellow ochre from turning green. If you want to use yellow in your sky, it's a good idea to work from blue to red to yellow. In that way, the red will help to diffuse the greenish tint you will get from mixing the blue and the yellow and create a natural grayish purple. The horizon blue is added to the bottom as it gives a softer, more opaque effect, creating distance. He regularly dips the brush in water to soften the hard lines. The paper isn't very wet, so it will quickly form hard edges if you are not careful. Use the damp brush to blend and soften the paint. Make sure that there isn't too much water on your brush by dabbing it on a paper towel if necessary. If your brush is wetter than the consistency of the paint on the paper, you will create blooms, which isn't always a good look. It is better sometimes to mix the paint on the paper versus mixing it in the palette. If you mix it on the paper, you have a more organic look in your colors. If you mix it on a palette, it can sometimes make a more solid look. So depending on what you do, you can choose to mix it on the paper or in the palette. Here he wants a specific purple color for the distant mountains. So now he mixes the paint on the palette. He uses a touch of Prussian blue mixed with a dab of Quin Magenta. It's a fairly cool mix, so it will push the mountains to the back once he adds it to the foreground. He starts painting wet on dry, just underneath the horizon line, and then he works the paint into the wetter area to soften the top of the mountain. He uses a bit of water to soften the bottom part of the mountain as well. For this background, you don't need any hard edges. The background should be very unobtrusive, as the focus will be on the trees and the rocks in the foreground. He doesn't clean the brush. He simply dips it into the various colors on the palette to create variation in the mountain range. Again, he uses clean water to soften the bottom part of the mountain and to wet the lower part of the picture plane beneath the horizon line. He mixes quin gold with the blues to create the various greens for the bushes in the middle ground. He dabs the greens in very lightly, and because the paper is wet, the paint disperses nicely into feathery bushes. To create distance, the bushes in the middle ground has a cooler green. He now uses the quin gold and the belly of the brush to start the foreground of the painting. The warm yellow brings the terrain more to the front. He uses stronger pigment here to build the values and to create a stronger pigment base for future layers. These layers will eventually give a lot more dimension to the foreground, so don't be shy with your pigments and colors. He uses all the colors from his palette, so it brings harmony into the painting from the beginning. Pay attention to the brush strokes here. He uses the tip of the brush to kind of draw in grasses, and even though the paint fuses into the rest of the paint, those lines are still there, and you will see them later on when he starts to draw in the grasses with a card. So from the beginning, use your brush to give direction to the plants or the growth that you have on the ground. Let the painting dry. The paper isn't very wet, so it's safe to use a hairdryer because it wouldn't disturb the paint. Now for the trees. Which comes first, the foliage or the trunks? It all depends on what you want to emphasize. If you do the leaves first, it lays the foundation for the direction of your branches. It allows you to only add suggestions of branches. Starting with the trunk and the branches will give you a structure to work from, but it is sometimes difficult to cover the branches with foliage in a natural way that will give you a 3D effect to the tree. For early autumn and summer trees, you would rather start with the foliage as it is denser and will allow you to add suggestions of branches and twigs. For early spring and winter trees, where the foliage is less, you might want to start with the trunks and branches and then just dab in some leaves. As usual, you start from light to dark. Heinrich now works wet on dry and uses Quingold to start with the lighter side of the tree, and he uses the belly of the Raphael Martora No. 4 round to dab in suggestions of foliage. He adds the pre-mixed greens from the palette to bring variation into the leaves. He uses the brush to define the shape of the tree. Notice that he does not only use greens, he also uses the pre-mixed greenish brown to add a darker shade to the leaves. The colors are not all painted solidly. He uses the belly to create a dry brush effect, which suggests loose leaves hanging from the branches. He places the trees close to each other, so the tree on the left catches more light. Therefore, the leaves are lighter in color. The middle tree is a touch higher, so the top of the tree will catch the light, while the bottom will be darker. The tree on the right is mostly in the shadow of the other trees. The next layer of the middle ground is a bit warmer than the distant bushes. He works wet on dry to create hard lines. The edges of the bushes will then come more to the front. This creates distance. Just like in math, it's a good idea to have balance. So he works on both sides of his focal point. It isn't always a very natural look, but he wanted to create a more structured layout. With this approach, you do run the risk of losing the spontaneity of nature, however. The Chinese calligraphy brush is ideal for fine detail, like the branches. Here he adds the trunks very lightly with a pre-mixed brown. These trees are the furthest away, so they are not very detailed, and they are much lighter. He adds a few shadow lines underneath each tree to ground the tree. It shouldn't look like it is floating in mid-air. For the main trees, he starts with yellow ochre. He draws the trunks to the desired length, starting from the foliage to the ground. To give it a natural look, the trunk is wider at the bottom than at the top. He adds a bit of brown on the right side to create a shadow line. Let the brown bleed into the yellow ochre by itself. This will help to create a natural, interesting look. He extends the branches into the foliage with light strokes. The colors used in these trees are warmer than those of the trees in the back. This helps to bring them forward. Again he grounds the trees and then he adds the next layer of foliage, wet on dry. The trees on the right are also in the distance, so again, there isn't a lot of detail. To add texture to the foreground, he uses the belly of the brush and a dry brush technique to add some grasses to create different levels in the terrain and to create a more distinct horizon line. He keeps building the values in the foreground and in the foliage. It is important to have your three basic values visible. Light, middle, and dark values give dimension to your objects. Heinrich builds up the immediate foreground with warmer colors. These will shine through once he has created the rocks. He uses the belly of the brush and works fairly lightly so as not to disturb the initial layers. Now he makes a mix of the primary colors on the palette to create a neutral dark color. This dark color is necessary to help create the shadows in the rocks. It is better to mix the dark rather than to use a flat black or dark brown, because the mixed color will spread and create interest when the paint is pushed around by the card. The dark pigment is stronger because the base layer is still damp. Adding a watery pigment here will cause blooms. At the moment, the dark addition looks quite scary, but it will serve its purpose soon. Work very lightly and lay down the flat wash and draw in a few grasses. Here Heinrich adds a few drops of yellow ochre, and it is a little bit more watery than the paint that's already on the paper, so it causes blooms. You can see how it spreads into the brown that is already on the page. So be very careful when you want to add some more paint that it should be a stronger consistency. Now in this case it wasn't a train smash, it actually created interest, the blooming effect. But if you don't want those blooms, make sure that the extra paint that you put onto the paper has a stronger consistency. He uses the corner of a store card to etch in some grass. It is important to have a stronger pigment foundation here. If this layer is too watery, the card will have no real effect. You will get two kinds of lines with the etching. On the very wet areas, you will find that the card makes a tiny furrow where the paint will pool, which gives you dark lines. Where the paint has settled a bit, the card will push the paint to one side, which will expose the layers underneath. The harder you press, the closer you will come to the actual paper. Be careful not to press too hard, or you might damage the paper. Now he uses the broader side of the card and gently swipes the paint to one side to expose the lighter layers underneath. This creates the illusion of rocks. This is a much easier way to create rocks than to painstakingly paint them by hand. Heinrich felt that his rocks were too consistent, so we recommend that you change direction regularly. Be careful not to fall into a modulated pattern. Let the painting dry thoroughly. He adds a glaze of Quin Gold to bring back a bit of warmth and light. Let the glaze dry. Now it is time to add the final details. He adds shadows to the rocks and to the trees. He also adds a few more details to the background to give it a bit more life. We hope you enjoyed this workshop with us. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions or suggestions. Thank you for watching. Vaya con Dios.